Well, good morning and welcome to the second of a series of 3 webinars from the IAA. And in this session, we're focusing on installation standards with a particular focus on work under the Green Homes grant and how compliance with the requirements can be evidenced. This follows the first session, which looked at product and system standards, and in the final session tomorrow morning we'll look at the process of gaining certification so that contractors can work on the Green Homes grant. I should say I'm Jerry Miller. I work as a consultant for the IAA, and the IAA's head of certification, Ron Fennick, will cover the second part of the presentation, which looks at quality management systems, which are a requirement. So a bit of housekeeping. There is a Q&A function. You should have a button, I think, helpfully marked Q&A. And if you post any questions, we'll cover those at the end of the short presentation. In terms of what we're looking at, kind of the landscape of installation standards, a bit more detail on PAS 2030, PAS 2035, and finally, as I mentioned, Ron will look at quality management systems. So, what installation standards do Green Homes grant installations need to satisfy, and how is that actually evidenced? Well, in terms of the standards, the building regulations themselves, because most work would fall under the building regs, just require that an installation is completed in a workmanlike manner. It's a slightly different process if it's under a competent person scheme, in which case the operatives need to meet minimum technical competencies for the measure involved. But all of the more prescriptive installation requirements are established by a number of other key documents. First of those is CE marking, which is not application specific, but may specify some requirements. There's also manufacturer's guidance, which supports CE marking. As we covered in the first session, a CE mark is really just a self-declaration that the product is safe to place on the market and meets the performance standards that the manufacturer has declared. So it doesn't really say anything about a specific application, it just talks about the product. More importantly, there are particular technical approvals such as Agrément certificates, which include a variety of application and system specific requirements in order to comply with the building regs. So a lot of the detail is in Agrément certificates in terms of the particular system and the particular application involved. Thirdly, and most importantly for Green Homes grant, there is publicly available specification 2030, which covers the process for the installation of work. We'll look at that in a bit more detail, but finally there are industry requirements such as the Trustmark framework operating regs, requirement for data warehouse lodgements, and industry guidance and best practice guides, all of which will say something about how the installation should take place. Some of it's mandatory, some of it's guidance, best practice guidance, but we'll quickly run through that. But in terms of funded insulation work, the 2 key standards are really the Agrément certificate and PAS 2030, which set out the meat of the installation requirements. So firstly, having a look at Agrément certificates. In case you're not familiar, an Agrément certificate covers a tested system which includes a number of prescribed components. So, for example, for cavity wall insulation, the tested system will include the blowing machine, the actual product that's used, etc. And particularly for cavity and external wall, it will specify system-specific requirements for the particular application to ensure that intended outcomes are achieved and, more importantly, the building regs are satisfied. An example of the type of requirements they impose: training and competence. They may include a requirement for the manufacturers to train operatives and even card them, and to carry out routine surveillance of the work that they're undertaking. In terms of assessment, it will set out the requirements for a pre-installation assessment, including suitability of the building for treatment, for example, cavity widths or exposure to wind-driven rain. There may also be constraints on the height of the building that can be treated. But again, these are application and system specific and can vary between different products. They will include some requirements in terms of vents, sleeving and safeguarding combustion vents, for example. They will usually cover some detailing of the design. So, for example, drill patterns, external wall corner reinforcement, patch placement, etc. They'll include some details on the installation process. And finally, they'll cover finishing and making good. So the key point about Agrément certificates is they establish the requirements for specific systems and applications. PAS 2030, on the other hand, sets out the generic processes that should be followed by installers using a particular product or system. So PAS 2030, wonderful 120-page read. As I say, it sets out the generic rather than system-specific procedures that installers need to follow in designing and installing, I think it's 38 different energy efficiency measures. It was originally introduced in 2014 as part of the Each Home Counts review to support Green Deal. And it's a relatively expensive document at £190 for 2030 and 2035 combined. But it is exceptionally available at a discount from BSI by quoting a TM50 code. And this is basically to make it easier for new entrants to become involved in Green Homes Grant. Green Homes Grant requires that installers are Trustmark registered, and Trustmark requires that they complete work according to PAS 2030, and additionally that is evidenced by being certified against that standard by an accredited certification body such as the IAA, so that it's clear that the work will be done according to that standard. So what does 2030 actually cover? Well, it sets out a specification to ensure that quality systems and installation processes are in place, meet best practice, and the whole purpose is to ensure that installation is according to specification and that it meets customers' expectations in terms of intended outcomes. So it covers, for example, the design of the building, of the installation. It needs to be a location-specific design, consider ventilation, assess ventilation, and upgrade if necessary. and validation of the design. In terms of the installation, it covers the process management of installation and handover skills, a whole variety of different aspects. There are provisions covering customer service and complaints, and all of that is underlaid by, as I say, 38, I think at last count, annexes, which specify measure-specific installation requirements. And that will look at operative competence, pre-installation assessments, any specific installation requirements. For example, in the latest version, you can't use verge trims on external wall insulation jobs. So that's kind of what it covers. In practice, life is always more complicated. There are two versions of PAS 2030. It was first amended in 2017 and then was re-amended in 2019. The 2019 revision hasn't changed the purpose of PAS 2030, but it introduced some important changes. Firstly, it recognises the publication of a new design PAS, inventively called PAS 2035, which covers the design requirement and competencies for the process of retrofit, based on a risk assessment for the building and the measures that are actually going to be installed. Importantly, the definition of competency changed from minimum technical competencies to a requirement for national vocational qualifications, and that is challenging. There is a dispensation currently in that you don't necessarily have to hold the NVQ, but at the very least you need to be working towards it. And there are competency ratios set out which define how many fully vocationally competent operatives are needed on each job. It also extended the requirement for independent surveillance of assessment, which is designed to make sure that the pre-installation building survey is carried out correctly and the building is actually suitable. And it incorporates, as I mentioned, a requirement for a PAS 2035 compliant location-specific design. And that there are some technical changes as well, but not that material. So 2019 is already more challenging because it incorporates and links, or is interlinked, with the new PAS 2035 and ups the game in terms of operative competence. So, what is PAS 2035? Well, it covers, the actual full title is a specification covering the retrofitting of dwellings for improved energy efficiency. And it's intended to set out the process for assessment and design and installation to ensure that the intended outcomes are delivered. It actually creates 5 new roles, including the key, which is the retrofit coordinator, who is charged with overseeing the project. There is a specific level 5 qualification that you need in order to become a retrofit coordinator. But the IAA does offer a retrofit coordination service and also a accreditation scheme for retrofit coordinators. So in terms of the process, what does it cover? Firstly, a requirement for independent retrofit advice. Currently, that is to be provided by a retrofit advisor. The likely direction of travel is that will change and become a simple signposting to a website in the next revision. So once the customer has decided what they may be interested in, The retrofit coordinator carries out an initial triage to identify the likely risk of the project and hence the competency requirements for the individual professionals involved in the retrofit project. The next stage is to carry out an assessment of the property. It probably won't come as any surprise that this is completed by a retrofit assessor. Broadly speaking, can be a DEA or a retrofit coordinator. Any of the roles can be fulfilled by the same or different people. The key is that they have to meet the competency requirements for that particular task. So the assessment includes an evaluation of the ventilation, and the result of that is recommendations as to what improvement options could actually be installed. Depending on the pathway that a project follows through the PAS, there are some other requirements for medium-term improvement plans, etc. But once the final package of measures has been agreed, they are designed by a retrofit designer who has to meet the competency requirements relevant to the pathway and the system or product involved. Once the design has been finalised, it's passed to a PAS 2030 certified installer, or if it's a microgen scheme, an MCS certified installer, and is installed in accordance with that standard. On completion of the work, there are requirements for commissioning and handover, and finally a monitoring and evaluation stage, which involves initially a simple questionnaire to determine whether the intended outcomes were achieved, but if they're not, there is an escalation process whereby it can go for more advanced monitoring and evaluation. So that's PAS 2030. Sounds simple. In reality, it is a more complex process because there are 3 risk pathways of increasing rigour, and these are selected depending on the measures and the building type, and establish the competencies. It can get quite complicated. In fact, PAS 2035 and PAS 2030-2019 by inference introduce a whole new world of complexity, which are quite challenging to deliver because the capacity of the required PAS 2035 roles is still being expanded. So, for example, retrofit coordinators, there aren't enough at the moment, although they are increasing in number, to actually deliver significant volumes of work. As a general comment, from a standing start, a contractor who is not currently certified against PAS 2030 would probably find it challenging to achieve PAS 2030-2019 and by inference PAS 2035 requirements in the Green Homes Grant timelines. They have been extended beyond March, but it's not clear when the requirement for PAS 2030-2019 will come in to that scheme. So whilst it runs out to March 22, at some point it will be necessary to deliver to 2019, but at the moment, as I say, it would be quite a task from a standing start to achieve certification against 2019. Just one important point, although PAS 2035 is referenced, it is not the installer who has to be accredited or certified rather against PAS 2035. It is the retrofit coordinator, and the key message is PAS 2035 is complex and makes delivery altogether more convoluted, but all an installer needs to do is be aware of PAS 2035 and to make sure that they get a design which they believe to be compliant with the requirements. So, having said how difficult it is to get 2030-2019, the question is what standard Green Homes grant work needs to be completed to. Well, basically either version. You can use 2017 or 2019. The landscape's a little complicated because many installers are transitioning from being 2017 certified to 2019, and any new installers coming in can only be certified against PAS 2019. However, recognizing the challenge and the need to get as many new contractors into the scheme as possible, BEIS and UCAS have introduced some temporary easements. And this basically allows an installer who's transitioned from 2017 to 2019 certification to continue to recognise their PAS 2030-2017 certification and basically complete work under the Green Homes grant to that older standard, which is simpler. As I mentioned, new entrants can only be certified against the 2019 revision, and that potentially would be a distortion of competition because, as I've mentioned, it's quite challenging to get 2019. It's a higher cost standard to deliver against, and therefore there will be a disadvantage for a new entrant compared with an installer who transitioned and was able to work to 2017. Well, as part of the easement and to address that, there are provisions which allow installers that apply for certification against 2019, where they can demonstrate that whilst they don't meet all of the requirements of 2019, they meet the requirements of 2017, then they can be temporarily certified up until the end of March against the older standard. Critically, that allows them to work on Green Homes grant because you can install to either standard, and getting certified to 2017 is a simpler, quicker process than 2019. So in the context of the 31st of March 21 date, that is the route to actually go. Okay, as mentioned, the requirement is to be PAS certified to evidence that the work is completed according to the relevant PAS 2030 edition. And the key question is what is needed to achieve PAS certification to enable the Green Homes grant to be accessed. Well, that's actually the subject of the third of these workshops. But a key requirement of the PAS is that the contractor has a documented quality management system to demonstrate they meet the requirements of the PAS. So Ron Fennick is now going to have a run through the question of quality management systems, what it looks like, and what the routes to actually putting one in place actually are. So Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, all. My name is Ron Fennick, and I'm head of certification for the IEA, and I hope to provide you with a further insight into the PAS 2030 requirements. So, having looked at the installation standards, we will now go on to the quality management system. PAS 2030 requires that businesses operate installation process management, service precision procedures, and policies. These are documented within a quality management system, which is key to improving quality and customer satisfaction. So what is required within QMS? Typical elements of the QMS, which consists of the range of records, registers, processes, procedures, policies, checklists and forms. In addition, PAS 2030 specifies requirements in respects of areas such as training and competence of technical staff and assessors, etc., management of subcontractors, pre-installation building inspection and installation process, commissioning, installation control and responsibilities of quality, documents, data control and record keeping, operation and process oversight to include products and materials, health and safety, etc. So on the next one. So PAS provisions. As a normative, mandatory, provisions of PAS, they cover the main activities and sub-clauses. As the attachment shows, some of the mandatory provisions are project management, retrofit design, specific to PAS 2013-19, the installation process, covering areas from method statement, storage of supplies through to the installation documents and record keeping, installation process management. This is process control and management, covering areas from oversight, pre-installation building inspection, installation process records to business and financial. Service provisions such as complaints procedures, complaints records and interactions with your clients. Claims of compliance covers obviously complaints. And finally, the annex, which can cover measure specific requirements. So to drill this down. To drill these down, these PAS then specifies the detailed requirements from what QMS procedures should cover. For example, 7.1, to satisfy the operation and process site provisions, there is a requirement to operate a procedure to ensure that pre-installation building inspection and installations are completed in compliance with PAS. 7.2, to satisfy pre-installation building inspections, there is a requirement to undertake a pre-installation inspection using a vocationally competent person as defined within the relevant measure-specific annex of PAS 2013-19 standard. When it is in accordance with PAS 2030-17, this will reference MTC, minimum technical competence. So how can this be evidenced? There are various ways you can capture evidence as part of PAS 2030 compliance. The above shows an example of a document to capture and evidence the requirement in respect of pre-installation building inspection having been satisfied. PAS provisions and procedures. For compliance within PAS 2030, there could be a few as 6 procedures corresponding to the main PAS headings, although for convenience, these may and might be split into sub-procedures, for example, covering training and competence. Examples of main PAS headings shown are project management, retrofit design, as a requirement within PAS 2030 and PAS 2030-19 standards, not specific to PAS 2030-17, installation, installation process management, service provisions, and claims of conformity. So going on to the next slide, which provides an example of which records you will need to create and maintain. The slide shows an example of records and documents. PAS specifies a wide range of records that must be created and maintained to demonstrate compliance, as illustrated by this non-exhaustive list. Areas covered such as calibration certificates and complaints, contracts, equipment records, health and safety documents such as risk assessments and methods of work, health and safety policy statements, pre-installation building inspection records, installation records such as method statements, certificates, data, reports, guarantees and any problems that may arise, insurance certificates, internal audits, certification, membership certificates, purchase orders, quotations, scheme registration certificates, subcontractors, training records, to include copies of qualifications and certificates of your technicians and staff. And as a result, a PAS compliant QMS can be complex and can run into many pages of documentation. So what are the options for contractors wishing to satisfy PAS 2030? There's probably three options. Firstly, you could write to your own QMS from scratch, in which you will need to identify PAS requirements, write the required policies, procedures and forms, etc. You can obtain a range of guidance and templates which are available from the IEA and Trustmark to assist you with this. Secondly, if you have an existing QMS, you could amend this to meet the requirements, in which you will need to carry out a gap analysis against PAS 2030 and then fill in the gaps to ensure it complies. And alternatively, thirdly, you could purchase an existing system. There is a range of cloud-based options which can be purchased at a relatively low cost, which potentially may be the easier route for yourself if there's nothing else in place. So how can you obtain further information? The IEA can provide a guide to PAS certification and a QMS overview. Trustmark can also provide QMS resources, which you can adapt. And lastly, there are various online QMS systems which you can purchase, as we've just said, and these can be potentially bespoke to the PAS 2030 QMS and your company requirements. And that brings us to the end of the Module 2 presentation and onto your questions.